So, welcome to Redefining AI, the podcast where we explore the frontier of artificial intelligence through the lens of leadership, innovation, and human-centered technology. I'm your host, Lauren Hawker-Zaffer, and today I'm joined by a guest whose work perfectly bridges the worlds of storytelling, technology, and human decision-making, Jacob Ward. Now, Jacob is a veteran journalist and correspondent who has covered science and technology for nearly 20 years now. He served as technology correspondent for NBC News, covering the Today Show, Nightly News, and MCNBC. And he's also led one of the world's major science magazines, having been editor-in-chief of Popular Science. His most recent book, The Loop: How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. Now, I'll go back to that because there's something interesting about that particular component. So his most recent book, The Loop: How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back, tackles how algorithmic systems in AI are influencing human decision-making and agency. He's also a founder of the media platform The Rip Current, where he continues to explore how technology and society intersect. In our conversation today, we will dive into how AI is not just a technical challenge, but a human one, what it means for choice, agency, leadership, and organizational culture. One thing that Jacob's particularly interested in and has spent a lot of time exploring recently as well is AI psychosis. So we'll explore how executives, operators, and change makers can approach AI and what is actually happening when we're looking at reshaping human thinking and our interaction with machines. Welcome, Jacob.
Lauren, I really appreciate it. Thank you for a really lovely introduction, being so thorough.
Is it thorough enough? Is there anything that you'd like to extend upon, maybe tell our audience a little bit more about a specific element of the introduction?
Well, you mentioned the discrepancy between the two subtitles of the book. So the book basically came out in hardcover. The Loop: How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back is all about AI. And I was trying to predict in the about 10 years I spent reporting that book that we were going to enter this crazy commercial AI world and that it was going to have huge effect on how we make decisions as individuals and as societies and as companies and as agencies. And when we were trying to put together, the right title for this book, my editor and I basically thought, well, shoot, no one's going to know what AI is because this was pre-transformer models. This was pre all this stuff. The movie AI had, I guess, people might know, but, people's eyes would glaze over when you'd start to talk about AI, at least people outside of the industry. And so we called it How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices. Now, back then, I published the book. I think I'm like 5 years early on this topic. And 9 months later, ChatGPT comes out. And so suddenly we scramble to put the paperback out with a new foreword accounting for this breaking news. And of course, we had to change it at that point to How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back, because we knew that would be, that was the original intention. And we just suddenly were like, oh, now everyone knows what this is. And so it actually works to our advantage. So it just, like, the two challenges of writing a book like that is, one, you want it to be current, and yet when you write about technology, you're constantly behind what's happening. And then on the other hand, I also was weirdly way more correct than I think I expected to be, or at least hoped to be. I didn't want to be as right as I turned out to be. I say that in all humility. And so that's been the tough part of the last couple of years, is watching my thesis come to life.
And both of those books are publicly accessible. I mean, you can buy both copies, or did you take one off?
You can buy the hardcover, which says How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices, and then you can buy the paperback, which is How AI is Creating a World Without Choices. The difference between them is a slight update to the paperback.
Okay. Have you noticed the difference in sales?
Lauren, I would be a better and more successful author if I paid better attention to sales, which also indicates how well or poorly that book sold. I was absolutely, I think, drowned in the flood of AI books that suddenly hit the shelves. And what's been gratifying about the last 6 months or so, I've kind of come out of my shell and begun sort of poking at people to say, I don't know if you've looked at this book or whatever. And it's amazing how many people have come to me and said, wow, I thought this was just another AI hype book. I didn't understand that you were trying to write this thing about how it's going to interact with human circuitry in this particular way. Because it's really, it's 10 years of reporting that goes into this and trying to cobble together as much of an understanding from research from the research community, from behavioral scientists about what, we've learned in the past from parallel domains around how humans make decisions and how they get influenced by stuff like this. And so, I don't know, it's been gratifying that people have been taking an interest in it. But yeah, will my kids go to college on the back of this book? No, that's not going to happen.
Okay, so I mean, one element is that you obviously spent 10 years reporting and preparing for the publication of the book. And you've mentioned from a behavioral science perspective, there was a lot of exploration there. What exactly were you exploring there in the 10 years?
Yeah, so I had spent several years working on a documentary project for American Public Television, PBS, called Hacking Your Mind. And that was a show that was in which I got to go all over the world and basically be a kind of guinea pig in experiment after experiment after experiment around things like implicit bias, the kinds of heuristics, as they're known, that govern the patterns by which we make choices, especially when we are stressed or deprived of the information we need. And prior to that experience, I really had considered myself I just thought I was a unique and beautiful snowflake and that my decisions were entirely my own. I'd bought into the American idea, right, that like we are all here with our bootstraps pulling ourselves up. And then I went out on this experience, this life-changing experience of being this guinea pig and just discovering how little of our decision-making is under our conscious control is the big lesson. That's the headline of the last 60 years of behavioral science, is that we are instinct-driven beings, and those instincts are incredibly manipulatable. They're incredibly shapeable, malleable. And so that realization was then bumping up against my work as a technology correspondent for Al Jazeera and then for NBC News, in which I just was looking around and realizing, oh, there's a million companies trying to shape people's behavior, and they're about to have the most powerful behavior shaping tool invented at their fingertips, and that's commercial AI. Once transformer models hit the technology that made ChatGPT and others possible, suddenly I was like, oh, here it comes. This is going to be an enormous problem, especially in the United States, where so many of these models are made. We just have such an allergy culturally to thinking about the circuitry of our brains as being beyond our control. And so that was what I was really focused on, was this idea that if you let the commercial market run wild with this technology, we're going to recode our behavior and wind up, if it all goes the way I was worried about, doing to our ability to make good decisions what GPS has done to our sense of direction. It's made it so you can't even find your way around your own town without GPS. And I think that's about to happen writ large across so many of our decisions.
This is something that you write about quite a lot and speak about quite a lot, Jacob, as well. I mean, you've written and you've spoken a lot about how AI and other technologies are changing our ability to choose. And I think in your book, you even call it, or a component is forefronted of, a world without choices.
Hmm.
How do you, because also you've spoken about there, like you think that little of our decisions is under our conscious control, which goes back to the element of choice. Like, how are you defining choice in this context? And what are you tapping into when, again, you're painting that portrayal of this conscious control?
Sure. So I guess I should just say that before anybody glazes over and thinks, well, this guy hates technology or is an anti-technologist, I just want to be clear that I spend a fair amount of the book trying to point out all the fantastically useful and I think productive ways we could be using AI for foundational science, for social services. There's a huge amount of insight and support that I think we could offer humanity through this technology. And I was the editor-in-chief of Popular Science magazine. Like, I like this stuff. The place that I get worried is when very big companies make very big bets and have to make that money back. And when those big bets put that kind of financial pressure on a company, and I think this is true both everywhere from like a small startup all the way through to a big company, in this case, trying to justify, $1 trillion in capital expenditures, I think you wind up in a place where you just try to find the quickest way to make money off people. And in this case, while I think there are an endless number of miraculous uses for this stuff that could, save lives, most of those are not going to make us the money that these companies are going to need. The ones that are going to make quick money, because we know this from the social media era and before, is mining people's attention, shaping their habits,
Mhm.
wherever we can. And In the case of this question of whether we're in control of our thoughts or not, so the big scientific framework around this, and cut me off here, Lauren, when I go on too long, but the there's this big concept that got popularized by a guy named Daniel Kahneman, that's basically this dual mode system of thinking. The idea that we have basically two brains, not literally but figuratively, one of which is instinctive and the other of which is conscious. And his thesis that he has spent a career and won a Nobel Prize proving is that that instinctive system is very much in the driver's seat most of the time. That's the system that allows you to drive from, your house to the wrong place without thinking about it, because you're in the habit of driving your kid to a school, let's say. And so when it's time to drive them to somewhere else or to the dentist in that morning, you accidentally drive them to school. When you come to in the parking lot and realize, oh my gosh, I've just driven my kid to the wrong place, right? You've gone through an elaborate mental and physical process, steering a half-ton vehicle through traffic without having any conscious experience of that, right? That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Mm.
And that system is one that's millions of years old. We share it with primates, right? And this is what study after study has shown. The system that instead gets engaged when you are truly making a choice for yourself is a very new and glitchy system. It's only a couple 100,000 years old. It's beta software. And that system is only really like a fact checker. It basically gets involved when that instinctive system can't handle what's being thrown at it. And this is what it's like, for instance, if you've ever been in the position, when I go from your accent, I assume, to your home country, and I have to drive on the wrong side of the road for me, suddenly that's an exhausting
Yes.
and vivid experience, right? You've done this. You've probably come to the United States and had to drive, right? It is a nightmare because
Conscious exercise.
it's a conscious exercise. Your brain is having to get involved and you're exhausted at the end of that,
Mm.
right? That's the difference between these two brains. So that instinctive system decides who to trust, what to eat, what your habits are, right? It outsources as much decision making as it possibly can to gut instinct, to your emotions, whatever it can. And the more sophisticated side, the newer, more conscious side, that's your creative, cautious, rational sense of yourself. But so for me, what that sets up is if you want it, basically, we want to use that instinctive side wherever we can. We can't help it. We're built to use that system whenever it possibly can take the wheel, it's going to take the wheel. And in the case of something like a system that offers to make your choices for you, would you like me to, help you be your thought partner in this thing and write a PDF that summarizes it and the rest of it, right? That is the perfect hack for that kind of system. And the other system that has to sit and think and drive on the wrong side of the road and really do these difficult pieces of calculation and decision making, we hate to make those choices, like having to sit and do the math. We don't like to do that. And if you're going to try and make money off somebody, which one of those are you going to try and sell to? You're going to sell to the instinct. You're not going to sell to the cautious, creative, rational part that makes these conscious decisions.
Of course. So, in looking at the way that you are portraying it with these two elements, you've got the two systems, the instinctive and the conscious. Is it that you're worried yourself in your research, your exploration, that this is an exploitation turnaround element in our journey and our interaction with technology? Because some might argue that, well, it existed before, as you mentioned, just like social media, there's that extinctive element. Advertisers, a lot of tech giants have been capitalizing it for ages. So, what's the difference in the introduction of, as you said, the commercialized AI system or model? Does it lead to what we were talking about earlier in this whole AI psychosis? Or is it just that it's just amplification? Because a lot of people are skeptical about the negative that can be amplified by, as you're saying, like the outsourcing, possibly going into the whole agentic world of outsourcing it even more. Is that what you're touching on?
Yeah. So the history of innovation, and as someone who's worked studying that history for a long time, I can tell you, right, the history of innovation has been that you can, that people have, as you say, tried, have taken advantage of instinct and predilection wherever possible. And in the West especially, we really like to believe, as I believed prior to, I'd say about 2013, that we were making our own choices, right? But in the modern era, we have, of course, bumped into a handful of places where we think to ourselves, oh, folks are not fully in the grip of, are not fully in charge of themselves. And in fact, in some cases are in the grip of a compulsion that their conscious mind cannot protect against. So one of these, for instance, is between 1950 and 1965. It took that long for the first scientific studies to establish the incredible danger and addictive potential of cigarettes. And the first big national law, not even law, national announcement from the Surgeon General of the United States that these were in fact bad for you and were linked to cancer and were addictive, right? Took that long to figure that stuff out. If you had asked a smoker, and as a former smoker, I can tell you authentically this is the case. If you asked a smoker in that period of time, right, when the studies had come out, but the Surgeon General hadn't quite issued his warning, in 1957, 58, you would have asked somebody, do you like smoking? Do you think you're in charge of your own choices when it comes to smoking? Would you like to, how do you feel about smoking? People would say, oh, I love smoking. I love smoking. It feels great in my brain. I can't imagine living without it, And we have, I think, traditionally, at least in this country, assumed that's all you need to go forward with creating a minimally viable product. If you've got people that feel that way about your product, then you have no other responsibility truly than to just fill that market gap, that hole in the market. Now, right, so there's an episode I think cover pretty extensively in the book. You have, and this is pre-AI, this is not even, we haven't even gotten to what AI makes possible. There is a whole industry of what are called social casino games. These are games that simulate blackjack, poker, the rest, and charge you money to play, but you can win no real money back. It is the definition of a loser's game.
Yeah.
Right? That is an incredibly enormous industry. It earns hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars a year. And it does it by finding people most susceptible to this loser's game through Facebook targeting is one of the many ways that they find their people. And I bumped into somebody at a party who actually, it turns out, had done that kind of marketing. And at that point, I had already met elderly women across the country who had lost their life savings to this incredibly idiotic game, right? And I asked this guy, I bumped into this guy at a party, and he turned out to have been doing the marketing at Facebook that would help these companies find these people. And I was like, wow, so how do you find people? It's one of these moments as a reporter where you got to keep your cool and not shake him by the shoulders, be like, I've been looking for you. You can't do that. You got to keep your ear up. And you just got to be like, oh, yeah, so interesting. Tell me more. And so I was like, so how did you find these people? And he said, oh, it's no problem. You cross-reference a low grade point average with a distressed line of credit, and you do a little geofencing based on that, and you've got them. Those are the people they need, right? And to my mind, when I look at that, so now people are beginning to sue because they're showing that these companies are preying on circuitry that people have no control over. There's nothing illegal about it. You can't sue on the basis of, you can't charge them with a criminal case.
No, I was going to say.
You can only sue, right? And I've spoken to people who worked inside the social casino companies, and you would be so appalled to hear what they sometimes have to say about it. They just say, well, people are people, people are just gamblers, and there's really nothing you can do about that. So the best, so we're just going to make a minimally viable product. We're going to make the right product that fits, that finds its customers and makes its market. And what I think we're about to get to is a world in which, I hope anyway, this is the fight back part of my subtitle, in which we're going to be able to start quantifying people's choices and their behavior beyond just saying people are their own, they drive their own car. They're in charge of themselves. Because between the scientific research that informs so much of the book and the case after case after case in which I'm finding industry after industry that really does whatever it can to put people beyond the ability to make choices, sometimes without even meaning to, I think AI is going to make that ability even stronger, which is, of course, what leads us to AI psychosis, right?
Yeah.
People truly losing touch with reality, coming to believe this thing is their friend, their lover, their spiritual leader, right? We're already seeing signs of people outsourcing their decision-making in the way that their ancient circuitry wants to, in a very dangerous and powerful way, Lauren.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I can understand and identify with the possible flaws that are presented by the power that is withheld by AI systems. There's the other side and the controversy around, as you've just mentioned, when we're looking at choice and that there's the expression of people are people. They might be people that are very happy to outsource their decision making. And this AI psychosis element that we've been talking about that you just mentioned and exemplified there is, to what extent are then people able to identify that it is a system interjection and who's responsible for that system interjection as well? And I think it leads to a bigger question around the whole ethical narrative when it comes to the introduction of the commercialized model of AI in itself.
Mhm.
There's a lot of discussion around that there was consciousness when we introduced AI at scale. There was consciousness when we made it accessible for individuals. We took it to a sort of B2C market where people were able to interact
Right.
with such powerful systems. And there wasn't really a sort of notion or knock at the plausible, loads of intrinsic, the intrinsic biases that are interjected into the systems, the ethical questions, the demographics that are essentially what we're highlighting, punished by the power of technology. I mean, that was conscious. That was a conscious step that people knew that this technology would transpire into something like this. So the question then maybe back is like, what do then business leaders have to do here, or
Yeah.
people themselves, as you're highlighting? You've given the example where people are using it maybe as a lover, as a coach, etc. What do they have to, what does the lesson hold,
Yeah.
Jacob?
So one way that I think about it is illustrated by an anecdote that I share a lot, which is I just by happenstance had two different interviews kind of back to back that were incredibly revealing to me. One was an interview with David Holtz, the CEO of Midjourney. And I was asking, this was early days when they had really just launched on Discord. They were just getting going. And I asked him about what responsibility he felt for some of the misuse, if you can call it that, right? In which people, famous people's likenesses are getting grabbed and the president's showing up in an orange jumpsuit and in news looking photographs. And, what responsibility do you feel for this? And we had a kind of back and forth about that. And his basic tenet was, I choose to believe that people are good. And so I make most of my decisions as a business leader based on that idea. And then he said, just sort of offhandedly, he said, well, imagine, he said, if I make muffins for a living and I make 10,000 muffins and somebody gets food poisoning, am I supposed to stop making muffins? Right. And there's this pause between us. And I was like, yeah, dude. Yeah, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. Like, that's what the Federal Food and Drug Administration would tell you. Like, because our standards for muffins are very high. Right? We really don't tolerate that. That's a 1 in 10,000 food poisoning case. That's a real problem. Yeah, they would say, you got to take everything off the shelf, figure out what's going on. Like, you got to stop production until you've solved this problem. A few weeks later, I just happened to go to a bakery that was a big industrial bakery that serves grocery stores in my region here in the Bay Area. And the CEO giving me the tour, at the very end of the tour, showed me the final step that all of these croissants and granola and everything else would go through. And that step was a metal detector. And I said, why would you go, what's with the metal detector? And he said, well, you've seen this warehouse, this factory. At some point, one of these machines is going to drop a bolt or a washer into the dough. And that is it's going to happen. We know it's going to happen. And so we have to catch that croissant. That cannot go out to somebody because it will ruin my business. If one person, I mean, you can imagine, right? If you bit into a croissant and had a washer in it, like like everyone listening to this can agree that like that is unacceptable. That would be an unimaginably unacceptable thing, right? So to my mind, one of the big dangers for business leaders is thinking of this purely as software, because the logic of developing software and rolling it out as a product is that scale solves your problems. The more of this you
That is
release,
true.
the more the
Exactly.
glitches get worked out, right?
You identify problems, you overcome them. That's the greatest
That's right.
challenge, especially
That's
in
right. That's
technological
right.
implementation.
That's
Scale is always the problem to solve.
yes. So I would argue that this needs to be thought of a little more like hardware, where scale compounds your problems. The more muffins, if your system continues to drop washers into the croissants and you're shipping more and more croissants, it doesn't matter if that number of washers and croissants becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of the total. It's an unacceptable number, right? And I think there's going to have to be some stuff around, I think like we live in a world already where people are using incredibly powerful addictive impulses in people to get them to save money, to get them to stay on the Peloton for an extra 20 minutes, right? There's some life-saving and life-improving ways, as you say, that we are outsourcing our choices to systems that game them to our benefit. And I believe that there are all kinds of versions of that can be possible. That feels good to me. The one in which you say, well, if, as in OpenAI's most recent report, 1.3 million people are openly discussing suicide among the 800 million weekly users, like what standard are we bringing to this? Are we thinking about this? Should we at least meet the standard of breakfast, right? Should we at least be meeting that standard in what we're doing? And to my mind, that's the thing, because I think we're playing with more dangerous stuff than just spreadsheets and your typical sort of software concerns.
Without passing an agreement here, I want to bring it full circle as well, because looking ahead, you've explored this notion of great ideas we should not pursue in technology. You've explored it yourself.
Yeah, that's the name of the next book that I'm working on now. Is called Great Ideas We Should Not Pursue. Yeah, which is a thing that I'll tell you, when you tell people in Silicon Valley that title, their heads pop off. People hate, some people anyway, tend to hate that title.
So if we stick to the context of AI, what is one innovation application? I mean, we've explored various angles. Do you believe we should pause on, Jacob, and why?
I think that allowing any form of commercialized companionship for young people is a nightmare. That's a terrible choice. That's a bad idea. I don't care how much of a customer pipeline that creates for you. I don't care how well that conforms to, that helps people habituate to what you imagine to be positive use cases for this stuff. I think that a brain up until the age of 25 is not ready to have a lifelike, sycophantic companion, much less one that is in any way sexualized, which is a huge booming industry now. That's a great idea we should not pursue. Don't do that, And that's one where I can just hear but shouldn't people be responsible for themselves and so forth? As I have had to argue with my 14-year-old over and over again, you're not qualified yet to make these choices for yourself. And so it seems to me that's one where we really, that's a good one. Let's stop making deeply sycophantic pseudo friends for kids at a time of one of the greatest mental health crises, we've faced in a modern society.
And I think in this point, we have to believe in the good of humanity. It goes back to your example that you hope that the good of humanity will pursue.
I think that's right. I mean, because we don't currently, at least not in the United States, have any regulations around this. The EU has done a better job of trying to get into some ex ante thinking around this stuff. What can we do to, and this is why people in Silicon Valley really are so upset about the EU's rules. But they're trying to get out in front of some of this stuff. In the US, there are no laws about this. And so we are, in a way, at the mercy of these companies. And so I would just invite the people who are thinking about this stuff to really think of yourself as having something of a holy responsibility. Your role is bigger than just delivering a minimally viable product. And if you don't take it that seriously, then I think in 20 years, maybe sooner, you're going to be on the wrong end of a really big legal action that's going to destroy your business and destroy your reputation. Because I think that very quickly, and we don't have time, I know, to get deep into it, but I am seeing instance after instance after instance in which very smart researchers and very smart lawyers are starting to figure out a legal case against people who manipulate human choice. And that, I think, is going to get stronger and stronger and more dangerous to a business. So that's a word of encouragement. I would go thinking about this.
It's certainly a point that we can agree on. I think it will. It's definitely going to be something that will be ever more pertinent in the future. So I'd like to thank you, Jacob, for this fascinating conversation and your insight. I think it's going to give our listeners, and will give our listeners, excellent food for thought to look at where we're going with AI and the consequences.
I really appreciate it, Lauren. I find that these conversations have been so fruitful, especially when I'm with people who come at it with, trying to think about this as clearly as they can, as you clearly are. Yeah, anybody who wants to talk to me more about this stuff, I'm easy to find.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who's come on this journey with us today and listened.